What's up, sound painters? In this lesson, I'm going to be talking about form. In the previous lesson, we talked about how to prepare your palette, or how to diversify the bank of options that you have available to you to create a musical form. Now, how do we actually structure that bank of options? That's what we're going to get into in this lesson. So by this point, you have your palette, you have chords or rhythmic cells or pitch cells, or you have like pulse patterns, or maybe you have contours, timbral combinations, instrumental combinations, orchestration ideas. Maybe you have like a list of all of the possible timbres or filters that a particular instrument can do, whether that be the flute, the clarinet, bassoon, cello, violin, whatever it is. And at this point, you're ready to start actually creating musical trajectories with this bank of options or with this palette. Now is the time to start establishing what the piece actually is going to be about. So you may have already started sketching ideas in time, as we talked about in the last lessons. So maybe if you haven't started doing that, what I would recommend is just start using this bank of options and improvising with your palette, improvise with pen and paper, pencil and paper. I would try to do this as analog as possible. In other words, don't go directly to notation software. One of the things that I find a lot of composers doing is like getting stuck in that always sitting at the computer and using notation software for that immediate feedback, which is really important for certain stages of the compositional process. But I feel that one of the traps with music notation is that notation itself is kind of an encoded language, which makes it a little bit hard to interpret in a realistic or accurate way relative to your ideas. And so I would try to, as often as possible, just use pencil and paper and whatever instrument that you're using, because there's going to be a much faster feedback loop between what you're doing and what you're writing. So play your instrument, record improvisations, and go back to the pen and paper and have this constant back and forth between the two of these as you sketch, so that you can start to establish what the piece is actually going to be about. Once you feel like you have a pretty good idea of certain like smaller scale blocks of music, you can start thinking about form. So a lot of the time this question comes up, like, what even is form? It can be a little bit complex depending on where you're studying or who you're asking. So a music theorist might give you a really convoluted, complex answer. But the way that I think about form is it's basically one of the most essential features of our daily lives. Like, we encounter form in the form of like biological form, in the form of our bodies, architectural form, the spaces around us, linguistic form, how words are actually put together to create ideas, or how to, structure larger scale things like a book maybe. Technological form, like the technology that we engage with, whether that be like simple technology like a shovel versus like an iPhone. So these are things that we are interacting with, and these all feed back into how we think about musical form, even if it's not on a completely conscious level. And this may already sound a little bit too convoluted, but musical form is basically just a response to the world around us and how we interact with that world. So that means that how we perceive musical form is of paramount importance, and I'll get into the reasons why as we go through the lesson. So to add just like a definition to this, form is how the elements of your music unfold in time. They may form sections, or it may be like one continuous uninterrupted idea, or maybe you have like blocks of music that are juxtaposed in contrasting ways that are completely unrelated to each other. Put simply, form is just going to be the bird's eye view of your music. So how do we actually hear form? Form is heard by usually big changes in the different layers or parameters of sound. So if you hear a big change in volume, a big change in texture, a big change in register, a big change in timbre, these are all going to signify to the mind that conditions have changed, we are now somewhere else. It's just like if you're going to leave your house, you know that you're not inside anymore when you're outside, because of temperature changes, because of the change in like the overall audioscape, the changes in the visual plane, it gets expanded, you're able to see the sky. All of these different cues, which we immediately, instantly signify as no longer inside. And so it's the same thing in music. Like if we were to think of big changes in, as I said, dynamics, texture, timbre, orchestration, rhythm, pitch, register, all of these things are going to influence how we're actually hearing a musical form or different musical areas. Other ways that are specific to how we actually hear form in music would be like if there's a silence. Silence is, in the traditional sense, sort of partition larger blocks of music. And so if there's a big breath in the music or a big silence, you're going to perceive, these different separate objects. Or it could be that the silence expands to a certain point where it actually imposes itself as its own section. And we know from 20th century music and from studying the music of John Cage that silence can in and of itself be a musical idea. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, it has been explored as its own musical entity. Now, we can also think about the relationship of parts to the whole as creating form. And this is a little bit more complex, but if we think about it in a different domain, like the visual arts, if we see a painting that has like a speck of red at the leftmost part of the painting, and then the other half of the painting is all red, as opposed to like what's in the left half of mostly green or blue or whatever, what color, you can sort of create this connection between these two because they have the same basic essential identity. And so we can create form by foreshadowing with a little speck of some small, tiny object what is to come later in the future. And so we're creating more complex forms, and this is very common like in storytelling. So I use the word foreshadowing. I think that this is a really powerful way that you can plant seeds for ideas to emerge later on in the piece. And so if you're paying attention and you're planting these seeds, you know how to nurture them so that they can grow into the trees that they were destined to become inside of the music. If you're not paying attention, then it just may sound like a bunch of random things that have nothing to do with each other. And this can happen. Now, when composers approach form, something that can happen a lot of the time is you will default on whatever form you're most comfortable using. And that's usually because there is a sort of limit of the number of forms that you're even aware exist. And that's because like the majority of music that exists adheres to a particular form relative to that genre. So if we think about songs, for example, the most common formulaic song form would be like verse, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, verse, bridge, chorus, 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 whatever. So that would be like sort of like the main blocks within the formulaic song form. Now, if we were to think about this in a more artistic way, like certain art rock bands or prog rock bands, or maybe some more experimental hip hop artists might try to experiment with this form to try to expand what the options are. And so you might get things that are maybe not really labelable as like the verse or the chorus or the bridge. They're just like things that happen within the context of the overall tapestry of the song. And so they add different levels of meaning, dimension, sound exploration, ambience, or whatever the case may be, depending on the genre. And I think that this is something that happens once you internalize the form. You're able to start experimenting with it. In classical music, we often find like binary forms. So binary form is basically a two-section piece, and you find them in like Bach's music, for example. You would find this kind of musical form in the cello suites, for example, or violin partitas, where there's an allemande or a courant or a gavotte or a gigue or something like that, which is basically divided in two sections, an A section and a B section, which have parallel materials. They are typically structured in a particular way, and there are variations of these specific kinds. Like we have rounded binary form. I'll get into those different kinds of nuanced forms in the theory course, so make sure that you're keeping up to date with those videos as well. But basically, it's a two-section form, right? Another option would be like a ternary form, which is a three-section piece where you usually have like the A section, a B section, and then a repetition of the A section, or some kind of like slight variation of the A section. Now, many composers have used this form. It's a super effective form, and I think that a lot of the time when composers of the 21st century actually start to use forms, they would probably default on like a binary form or a ternary form or a rondo form, which I'll talk about in a second. So in the notes section below, I'm going to link some examples of specific pieces that actually use like binary form or rondo form or ternary form, so that you have a sense of how composers are actually using these specific formal structures. For the ternary form, I've included a Chopin nocturne, so it's Opus 48 number 1 in C minor. So it has like an A section in C minor, the B section's in C major, and then it goes back to C minor, and some of the rhythmic elements from the B section are actually grafted onto like the second A section. So it's sort of like an A prime section. So this is what I mean when it's like some slight variation of that second A section. So it repeats the original materials, but there are certain new elements that are added. Another classical form that's super common is sonata form. So sonata form is basically like a ternary form because it has three main sections, but it has a few more extra elements or moving parts. So the first section is called the exposition, where you have an A theme and a B theme, and the A theme is in the home key. The B theme is in either a closely related key or a distantly related key, where you have a contrasting theme. Then that section repeats, you hear both of those themes again. Once the repetition ends, you go to the development section, that's the second section, where you sort of like hear a lot of explorations or unfoldings of those initial elements from the A and B themes. And so it's a sort of anything goes section where you may hear like transpositions or inversions or rhythmic augmentations or diminutions, retrogrades, anything that is sort of like expanding your perception of what is possible within the realm of these two main themes. And once that section wraps up, you get the recapitulation, which is like the representation of the first exposition section. What contrasts the recapitulation is that you're going to have both the A and B themes in the home key. And so usually the recapitulation is going to happen in a moment of heightened emotional tension because developments tend to have just a greater amount of turbulence or tumultuousness, so that builds up to the recapitulation, so that that moment when you get back to the home key, the home theme, it feels like a triumphant return. That's very frequently how it unfolds in time. Now, this may not apply to every single sonata ever written, but I think it's a pretty safe generalization, especially in like large scale symphonic works. Usually this is going to happen in like the first movement of a symphony, the first movement of a concerto, which has a double exposition where you hear like the orchestra play the exposition, then the soloist comes in, plays the exposition, then development, and then the recap. String quartets can sometimes have these, and anything that's named a sonata from before the 20th century uses its form. Again, in the notes, I'm going to add specific examples, and what I've done is I've taken the first movement from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and I've just like put links for like the specific moments where you hear like the A theme, the B theme, the development, and the recap, so that you can track where these things are actually happening. And what I would actually recommend is like listen to the piece without looking at the notes first, and see if you can write those second markings out on your own and see how it lines up with mine, to see if you're like perceiving the form as it was actually conceived by Beethoven. I mentioned the rondo form earlier. So the rondo form is basically a kind of form where you have contrasting ideas or themes, where you have an A theme, a B theme, a C theme, a D theme, an E theme, and it can sort of be infinite in a way, theoretically. Usually a composer will max out like around 4 or 5, and they will just alternate between these where it's always refraining back to the A section. So you will have like A, B, A, C, A, D, A, E, and so on. And usually a composer will take whatever is like the last different section as the axis of symmetry, and then just reflect back the sections that preceded it. So if we have like 4 contrasting types of sections, it would be like A, B, A, C, A, D. D is the axis of symmetry, then it goes back to A, C, A, B, A, and then that would be the end of the piece. We also have themes and variation, which are kind of self-explanatory, but basically you have one particular kind of thematic material that is then put through a bunch of different filters. So when I say filter, I mean like it can just be completely transformed by dynamics, articulation, tempo, transposition, key. So composers are basically free to modify anything, but they must maintain the basic essence of the idea. So that would probably be like the thematic idea, the proportional distance between the the moving parts of the melody. The basic contour of the melody is going to be basically the same. So one example might be like you have like a short percussive peppy upbeat theme, and then maybe by like the 8th variation you have like a much more somber version of that theme that's more sustained, that has much more chromaticism in it, but you're still hearing those main notes being hit at the right times so that you can still perceive it inside of this new version. But it's just filtered through different colors and different dynamic levels, different tempo markings, and so forth, different expressive markings, articulations, and so on. And so you can do this in a way where each theme and variation is completely different, or it can be a gradual process where it becomes more and more different and transformed into something completely different. Or you can do something that's sort of in the middle where you transition towards something that's really contrasting by like the fifth variation, and then you have something that's like an exact repetition of the earlier one or something really close to it, and then pick off where you left off in variation 5, and sort of you can mix and match sort of where you're going to have contrast and difference to create other kinds of forms within the idea of theme and variation. So there's a lot of freedom in that sense. In the 20th century, there were many developments in form. One of the developments in form was in the so-called minimalist genre. So one of the composers that was sort of central in the development of this kind of music was Steve Reich. And Steve Reich in the 60s started writing process forms, one of which was in the piece Piano Phase. And again, I'm going to leave a link to that piece so you can listen to it to hear what that sound world sounds like. But basically, a process form is a kind of form where like you set something in motion and it runs until the process is over. In Piano Phase, basically you have like a 12-note pattern that's played by two pianists. At first, they start in unison. So they're playing the exact same thing. But then there's a moment where they phase out of each other. In other words, like they're going to get displaced. So one pianist accelerates slightly until they're offset by 1/16th note. And that's the process. So there are 12 notes. Reich wants the performers to be able to do all possible permutations of that 12-note set. And so you're going to have every single possibility where the phasing offsets every time by 1/16th note. So you hear all of these different combinations, and the result of that is a bunch of different emergent rhythms, emergent melodies, and that's kind of how the piece is developed. And there's another piece called Violin Phase, so if you really like Piano Phase, you can check that one out. But that's basically what a process form is. There are many ways that you can conceive of this, but essentially it's like you set something in motion, and once the momentum stops or once the process is over, the piece is over. There's not really an intuitive approach to creating chord progressions or melodies. It's not really about that. It's really just about hearing this process unfold. Another kind of form that emerged in the 20th century was what I like to call juxtaposition or block forms. And one of the examples that I tend to use a lot of the time when I talk with composers about this form is Stravinsky's symphonies of wind instruments. And basically in this piece, and I don't have the exact form in front of me, but it's basically set up to have like many contrasting ideas juxtaposed against one another. And so if you were to categorize them with letters, you might, like we would do in a rondo form, for example, you might label them as like A, B, A, C, D, E, A, F, A, G, B. And so it's sort of like a discontinuous unfolding of all of these contrasting ideas that sort of feel like they have nothing to do with one another. And that's kind of what makes it distinct from a rondo form, is there's not a specific pattern to how these are ordered. It's just what Stravinsky in that case felt like juxtaposing next to each other based on whatever decisions he was making musically. And it could be that he wanted one to be mostly brass sound. Maybe one was mostly supposed to be like high brass and woodwinds. Maybe another one was supposed to be just bassoon. So they're very contrasting, not just in like timbre, but orchestration, dimension of the dynamic range, of the actual pitch materials. So every single layer of sound is very contrasting, you know, relative to what's around it, so that you can create this impression of discontinuity. Another example would be like Messiaen's Catalogue of the Birds or Catalogue des Oiseaux. So I will also leave a link to that in the description or in the, you know, in the notes section below this video. So make sure to check that out. But basically you have like specific identifiable patterns that occur at the piano, and then it's contrasted with other distinct patterns that have nothing to do with that one or that are distantly related. And so you create this sort of impression of discontinuity that way. And maybe, and I'm just now interpreting what that might mean, is like, since it's a catalog of specific kinds of birds, maybe what Messiaen is trying to communicate through the piano is this impression of nature and how there are these sorts of like different moments in which your attention is drawn towards a bird in that direction or in the other direction, and maybe they're the same kind of bird or different kinds of birds, or maybe they're interacting with the different species, or maybe there are certain sounds in the environment like wind blowing through the leaves, or maybe there are frogs in a pond somewhere. And so there's sort of like a biospectrum that's sort of being represented in a very pixelated way through the lens of what a piano can actually achieve. And this is maybe just my own, poetic interpretation or reading about what Messiaen is achieving with the piano in this piece. But this is sort of another option, is like the juxtaposition kind of form. And you see this in other composers' work. Another example would be like in a more recent piece, Gerard Griset's Vortex Temporum. There's a piano solo in the first movement that is very similar to these two examples, where you have like specific objects that are juxtaposed against each other so that you have this feeling of discontinuity. That's what is crucial about this kind of form, is the discontinuous nature. Another way that you can think about form, and this is much more open and mutable, is parametric form. Now, parametric form is basically like thinking about the various layers of sound, like pitch, rhythm, dynamics, timbre, texture, and so on, and just creating forms within them. So if we just look at one layer, if we just look at pitch, let's say that we want to create a form of high to low or low to high. This would be one way to sort of structure longer scale trajectories. Or maybe you want to look at just dynamics, so soft to loud or loud to soft, just rhythm, sustains to blips, right? There are ways that you can start to just structure broader swaths of music, thinking just about the parameters or just about the longer scale trajectories of a particular layer that you want to do. And very frequently, these are going to be in combination with one another. So you might actually compose a piece that goes from high to low, from soft to loud, and it will happen at the same time. Now, you could also create like sort of zigzags, so it's not super linear, because sometimes those kinds of linear forms can then sort of become predictable and boring for the ear to listen to. But that would be one way of just adding a little bit of surprise or diversity within like the trajectory from one end of the spectrum to the other, whether that be like loud to soft, or whether that be from low to high, and so forth. Now, there are also kinds of directional forms where you have a particular direction that you're trying to achieve. And this can happen in pitch. So as I said, high to low to high, low to medium to low to high, whatever the case may be in your piece. You can also think about like large scale proportional accelerations, where like blocks of music get consecutively shorter and shorter to create the impression of an acceleration, even if the tempo never actually changes. So when we think about these contrapuntal interactions between the different parameters of sound, it's really important to remember, even first species counterpoint rules. So what makes good counterpoint? Well, not repeating the same note too many times. So if you get to that same peak too many times in your trajectory of like the pitch layer, it might start to diminish the impact that that particular peak has. Or if you have, repetitions of like the apex of that line, it's not really going to have the same impact if it's like a singular, more exaggerated apex within the line. And so these sorts of conceptual approaches, thinking through the lens of traditional counterpoint, can actually be really, really powerful from the perspective of thinking about parametric forms. Now, again, these kinds of forms are super open and free, so this will require maybe a little bit more planning in advance for how you're actually going to achieve that. And it may be less informed by intuition and more by abstract planning. Another kind of thing that can happen, particularly in the temporal domain, would be like a directional form in rhythm, where you would have like a particular direction if it's accelerating or decelerating, or if you have some kind of like interpolation of like long and short blocks, where like gradually the long ones become shorter and gradually the short ones become longer. So there's sort of a crossfade or a voice crossing, so to speak, between proportions. So I will leave an example of like a proportional acceleration that we can find, again, like in Vortex Temporum, this piece by Gerard Griset, where specific ideas are measured and they proportionally get accelerated until they reach sort of like a breaking point, and then it shifts into a different section. Then there's another kind of acceleration. So I will leave a link to that piece, and I will also link a screenshot to an analysis I did of those proportions so you can actually see the trajectory of the acceleration from like that first 3-minute section. And when you listen to this piece, it's going to make sense. Now, when you think about this parametric form in the realm of timbre, you can think about moving from one instrumental body to the next. So thinking about like strings to brass to woodwinds to percussion, or maybe strings to percussion to woodwinds to brass to piano to harp, whatever instrumentation that you have or what you're actually working with. When I work with percussion, for example, this is a really powerful way of building forms. In my piece Breathless, this was how I was thinking about form, was I'm going to transition from like mostly wooden plank sounds to mostly snare drums to then metals to then, you know, and the piece sort of unfolds based on these specific groups of instrumental timbres or, you know, instrumental profiles. And it's also just a smart way of making sure that all of the instruments in the percussion setup are actually used so that you don't have just like one crotal sound in the piece and then it's never used again. Percussionists basically hate this because they have to pack that crotal, and if they're not going to use it much, it's sort of frustrating for them. So it's one way of just ensuring that all of the instruments get used. And this is also what good orchestrators will do because they know that musicians' time is not cheap, so they want to make sure that they're making the performance and the rehearsals worth the time of all the players. So let's just summarize. So we basically have like traditional classical forms, we have song form, we have process forms. Parametric form, we have directional form where like rhythms can accelerate or proportions can accelerate or crossfade between each other. There are all kinds of different approaches to form. So we have to be really sensitive to what the musical materials actually want to do, because some ideas are not compatible with some forms. And what can happen for a lot of composers is that we will try to squeeze an idea into a particular form because we think, well, I have 2 ideas, I'll just do ABA. Or, well, I have 3 ideas, I'll just do rondo. Or I have 2 ideas, so I'm just going to do a binary form. And that can work, that can be effective. But if you also think about like spectra or, you know, sort of parametric trajectories from like low to high, from soft to loud, from, you know, noise to pure sound. When I say pure, I mean like signal, like pure note frequency. If you're aware that there are other alternatives, then you may actually have a better way of containing the idea that you came up with in the first place, rather than try to squeeze it into a box it doesn't belong in. Now, I know that I've provided all of these options for you, and while it may be tempting to plan out what your form is going to be prior to composing, we also have to be sensitive to the fact that sometimes form is emergent. So sometimes, as we're composing, we open doors that we should go through and the music wants to go through. If you have this like really complex map that you planned in the pre-compositional phase that you really want to adhere to, but then you get to a moment in the piece where the music seems to be suggesting that you pursue another direction that's contrary to what you planned, don't be afraid to abandon your map, because the music is going to be a better guide of what it wants to do than that initial map. So we have to conceive of this formal planning as just a way of getting the momentum to then do what the music wants to do. So this requires patience and empathy, because it's not always going to be immediately obvious when you open that door what you're supposed to do. But if you're a good listener and you're empathetic with what the music wants to do, then you're going to create a musical experience that's going to be much more enriching and satisfying for the listener. Sometimes this just means like sacrificing these abstract plans or sketches or ideas, conceptions, so that the music can actually breathe and live the way that it wants to, rather than you trying to like impose your composer's will on it. And that's just going to be a much more enriching experience for the listener, as I said before. I know that I covered a lot, but I hope that this was a good lesson on how you can start thinking about form in your own music. Now, in the next videos, I'm just going to demonstrate how I would take a particular set of objects and categorize them so that I can then start thinking about form. I got into this a little bit in the Prepare the Palette video, but I'm just going to do a couple of demos so that you have an idea of like, if you have a particular idea, how can you actually structure it in time? See you in the next lesson.